So a couple of just comments pre-sermon. One of them is I need to make an official position statement for the church. And I don't do this lightly, but just want it to be known that in the Ryder Cup, we are neutral. Now I'm seeing the signs around the neighborhood, and I know that's not true of all of you. In fact, my next door neighbor is a little bit belligerent about his particular team. But just kind of wanted to know that if you come by the 12th tee and you see a Switzerland flag in my yard, you'll know that's a sign of neutrality that I'm officially taking. So, but what fun. It's fun to watch all this. Also, I want to let you know that we're going to be going through the book of Ephesians and finishing that. I'll actually do a talk geared more towards men next week, but women, don't skip it. In fact, if you get to tell your men, that's what you should have been doing. But I know it's not a condemning talk. Hopefully it's an encouraging one. And then we'll be back in to finish up Ephesians. And then after that, I want to do a series sometime as we wrap out the year called You Asked For It. And this has to do with what questions do you have? It may be a biblical study. Maybe you say, hey, I'd like to understand this book of the Bible. It may be something more along the lines of I want to know how to handle stress, anger, grief, whatever it might be. Just check that out, and next week we're going to have comment cards in all your bulletins, and you can simply write, you don't have to put your name. Just put what you would like in that series. I can't promise you I'll cover them all, but we'd just like to kind of hear from you guys. What are some of the things that you're working through and wrestling through, and so we can plan that into our sermon series. Now, I think I may have found the source of our cutting off. I think it's my antenna. But anyway, you can't do anything about it. I'm just looking at you to let you know. If I hold it right here, I think we're in good shape. Sorry. We always technology is fun. This morning, we are in Ephesians chapter 6, and we're going to be looking at verses 5 through 9. Now, this is in a sub-series that we've been talking about, where we talk about God's blueprint for strong families. And this is an interesting text because it's dealing with the master-slave relationship. Now, in that context, this was still part of the family code. Because in that context, so many people were either employed by or they employed household servants, people that worked for them. It was a very different environment, but in many ways that was part of the household that was there. In fact, sometimes the kids were mentored and discipled by someone who lived with them. And so all of these things are a context in which we understand this is family. And I think for us, as we translate that to our world today, we'll talk about some of the applications of that. But I do think there's some direct applications of employer and employee relationships. And so that's the kind of tact that we're going to take as we walk through this. And I don't know what your work history is. I know we have a lot of people in the room that are retired or getting really close to retirement, like you're leaning over the finish line. I also know that others are in the middle of their career. And I was just thinking back on my employment history. And I started writing down all the jobs that I've held since my time in high school. And I pretty much feel like I'm unemployable because of all the things. But I've worked my way through both my undergraduate and graduate work. So there were times when I was working 2 jobs and going to school. And I was just thinking, one of the first jobs I had was with my dad. My dad was an industrial and commercial contractor. And so he thought it'd be a good idea to put his teenage son out in the warehouse. And so that when people needed tools on a job site, they would either come get it there or they would call me and I would bring it to them. And he said, in your downtime, when you're not delivering something or people are picking something up, he went out there and he showed me these 2 large barrels. I mean, these were this tall. And they were just filled with nuts and bolts and wires. And he said, this is basically our electricians dumped all of their stuff from their trucks in here. Now you get to sort those in your downtime. You're talking about one of the most meaningless jobs I feel like I have ever, because I really knew they didn't really need these. At this point it was much more of giving me something to do during those dead times. But I think about that and trying to find meaning in the moment of sorting nuts and bolts. And I'm sure you've probably had experiences like that. I can remember working in my grandparents' garden. First job I ever had outside of kind of the family was washing trucks as they came off the railroad cars down on Presence Island in Memphis. And it was an interesting short time. I worked preload at UPS. I worked in the construction industry, everything from a laborer to a project manager to an estimator. I worked for a year as a file clerk. I worked for a couple of years for a freight shipping company, starting out on the docks, and then as a account manager for them while I was in seminary. And then I started my ministry career after most of that. I just say that to say that you're probably in the same boat. You could probably talk about those different jobs. Some of them were fulfilling. Some of them brought home a paycheck. And then many of us ended up in management roles where we were overseeing. Maybe you started our own company, or maybe we're just in a management position. And so we actually have the opportunity to lead others in the workplace. And what I want to walk away with today is something that is very simple. But the overall statement that I'm interested in is that we know that we are to serve Jesus in our work. We're to do it with wholehearted commitment to excellence. Now, let's see what the text says and why we come to that conclusion. If we look here at, by the way, a word of, before any of you tune me out, if you were retired, let me say two things. These may be some great things you can pass on to the next generation that you're interacting with, whether they're your kids, grandkids, or whatever. But I'll also say this. If you're not dead, you're not done. God still has work for you to do. And excuse me if I step on any toes, but if your entire life is getting up in the morning, playing golf, having a few beers, taking a nap, having dinner, watching a movie, and doing it all over again, you need to hear that your work's not done. God has you here for a purpose. At this time and in this place, with all of your life experiences, to do His will. So, we'll talk about that sometime in the future, but that will touch on that a little bit as we walk through these texts. So, first of all, the goal of your work is to serve Jesus. Look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5 says, bondservants. These were people that were they were enlisted to work for individuals, and some of them actually had the opportunity to work out of their servanthood into ownership, but it's a bondservant. It says, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Now, he immediately begins to say, this isn't just about serving your boss. It's about serving the same way that you would serve Jesus. Now, most of us would probably say, if Jesus was my boss, I'd work hard. You don't know my boss. This text says, doesn't matter who your boss is. You're to serve them in the same way you would serve Christ. Now, he's not taking that to the ultimate loyalty that we deserve Christ, but he is simply talking about following his directives, his instructions. Our goal of our work is simply to serve Jesus Christ. I came to that conclusion, thankfully, in that warehouse sorting nuts and bolts. And I began to think, well, you know what? Nobody's going to know if I'm really doing this or not. I could sit over there and probably do nothing, and I didn't have a cell phone then, but there's phone calls I could have made and different things, and it just hit me as I was even a young man saying, nobody else might know, but Jesus will. And it wasn't so much out of guilt, but, oh, yeah, he's the one I'm really serving. And so in that moment, reorienting my thoughts and my mind to saying, I'm going to do this out of respect for my Lord. And I'm going to be the best nuts and bolts sorter in the city. Here's the other thing we need to understand on that. We oftentimes work for bonuses and rewards and promotions. But we need to understand Jesus gives us a greater reward. There is no reward you have on this earth that will compare to the reward that he will give you when you are in his presence. In fact, we know the text in the scripture that says that the servants came before their Lord, and the Lord said, either get away from me, you worthless servant, or enter into my presence. Well done, good and faithful servant. And I want to say that's not just about doing church work or spiritual things. It's about whatever God has given you to do it for the Lord, to do it for his glory. And if you do that, in the end, even if you never get any promotion, even if you never get any bonus in this earth, God will give you your reward. So we need to understand our greater reward is actually there. Now the second thing we need to realize is the attitude that we bring to work. And listen to what the text says here. He began there by saying, doing it with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart. So that means not just for show, not just when people are watching, but with a sincere heart. And he goes on, not by the way of eye service. I ran track in high school. And I can remember him sending us down to the track. The coach sent us down there and he told us, hey, you need to just run, warm up and everything. And so a few of us, rule followers, did so, while others sat on the sidelines, and one of the guys went up on top of the hill where he could see if the coach was coming. And when he saw the coach coming, he would yell down, "Coach!" And everybody would get out there and run. Now, I oftentimes thought he probably should have figured it out when some of us were dead tired at the end of the track and others weren't. But again, this is just a very simple indication of all of us will work when somebody's watching us, but will we work when nobody is watching us, when nobody's monitoring our time? Here he says, not just by eye service, as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, that reward, whether he is a bondservant or whether he is free. One of the most important things that I believe in your attitude to work is to bring a wholehearted commitment to excellence. A wholehearted commitment to excellence. Now, anybody who's a manager of people says, yes, I wish all of my employees, all of my folks understood that. And you would hope that you can coach them in that. But this idea of excellence is as much an issue of attitude as it is skill. You need to be sure that you're bringing the right attitude to whatever work God has called you to. And what is that attitude in this text? It's respect and fear. So there's a humbleness in which you come, even in your attitude to work. There's also a sincerity of heart. You're not just doing it for eye service. Yet attitude for some of us is one of the hardest things. And it can even be harder in our culture when you wake up and you look at the news, you look at social media or whatever it is, and immediately your attitude can do this. Listen to what Chuck Swindoll says. This is a rather long quote, but I think he speaks to the issue of attitude better than anybody I've ever heard. He says this, he says, the longer I live, the more I realize the impact of attitude on life. Attitude, to me, is more important than facts. It is more important than the past, than education, than money, than circumstances, than failures, than successes, than what other people think or say or do. It is more important than appearance, giftedness, or skill. It will make or break a company, a church, and a home. The remarkable thing is that we have a choice every day regarding the attitude we'll embrace for that day. We cannot change our past. We cannot change the fact that people will act in certain ways. We cannot change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play on the one string we have, and that is our attitude. I am convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% of how I react to it. And so it is with you. We are in charge of our attitudes. So what attitude do you take in the everyday world in which God has called you? To take this attitude that says, I'm serving the Lord and I'm doing it actually for the good of those that I serve is incredibly important. So not only do we need to have that attitude, I think a good attitude, we do need to strive for excellence. And excellence is defined a number of different ways. One writer has defined excellence is combining attitude and excellence. Excellence is not a skill, it's actually an attitude. Aristotle said this, excellence is an art won by training and habituation. We do not act rightly because we have virtue or excellence, but rather we have those because we have acted rightly. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. I love that statement. It's not just an act, it's a habit. And I told this to my kids as they're growing up. Part of your understanding a good work ethic is that it becomes the normal in your life. It becomes your habit of life. So that no matter what you're doing, whether it's a volunteer project or whether it's working for your boss or yourself, you have built into your life a habit of doing things with excellence. Excellence is not perfection. Excellence means you do it to the very best of your ability with the right attitude. None of us are perfect. None of us are perfect. But we can all be excellent in what we do. The final thing is effort. We have attitude, excellence, and the final thing here that has to do with the way that we work is effort. Two questions I think we can always ask ourselves. One is, are your attentions divided while you are at work? I was really hit by something a number of years ago when I was talking about how busy I was in the ministry that I had. And somebody just stopped, and in their gentle way, they knew one of the individuals that I had grown up kind of looking to was John MacArthur. And he goes, do you think you're busier than John MacArthur? I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, well, he runs a seminary, a church. He writes about 1 or 2 books a year, preaches sermons every week. I mean, you got a heavier load than that. Plus, he does all the other pastoral things that you're probably doing. And I'm all of a sudden hitting it and thinking, well, my issue, even though I really did work hard, was to work on the right things at the right time. And yet effort is always important, so that we give the best of what we can do. You have all probably been in situations where somebody talks about how busy they are, and then you look at their life and you're like, I'm not so sure. I've had 2 situations that stands out to me. One of them when I was doing single adult ministry. I would always have these young men say, I'm just too busy. I've just got too much going on. No matter what you asked them to do, they were busy. And so I had a little thing I would do. I would get a piece of paper and I would take them to breakfast or lunch, and I would say, all right, I want you to put a line down the middle of the column. And on the left column, I want you to put the things you have to do. I mean, they're responsibilities. If you don't do them, they fall upon you. And on the right, put the things that you have the freedom to do. They're choices that you make. And almost inevitably, on the left column, they put my job. And then they stopped. Because they weren't married, they didn't have a wife, or they didn't have kids. They really hadn't developed a lot of other things in their life that were relying upon them. It was basically their job. And then the other column would be 15, 20, 30 things that were in that column of, no, you have choice over these. And so whatever you want to do, you need to say, okay, what do I need to do here that will really show excellence in my life as I serve the Lord? Another one was just walking by one of the individuals who I employed a number of years ago, and as I was walking by the room that a couple of them worked in, I noticed she very quickly jumped off Facebook. And so that became a little bit of a habit, and then that was fine until that meeting that I had where I had the staff together, and I said, guys, here's a new initiative we're going to do, and here's some of the things we're going in. And 2 of the ladies, and she was one of them, just really got upset. We're too busy. We don't have time to take that on. And, in my flesh, I wanted to say, oh, really? Instead, it was a conversation later with her one-on-one. But we realized that this idea of effort, oftentimes in our world, we are so easily diverted by other things. And here's the question that I always ask. Does it take someone else to monitor your job for excellence? Or do you self-monitor yourself for working with excellence? Well, what does excellence look like in action within employers and employees? So let's conclude with these 2 thoughts. And they, again, are from this text because he jumps into chapter 9 and begins to talk about masters. But before we leave the employee, let's look at one overriding principle that this text has for employees. And it is this. Employees should go above and beyond in obedience to their employer. Just what we've been saying. Go above and beyond in obedience to their employer. I tell my kids that now. They're young adults. And I'm like, don't just get the job done. Do the next thing. Go above and beyond. Find something that needs to be doing and do it. Don't just think you get your job done, then I'm going to sit around until the boss gives me something else. Find a way to help somebody. Find a way to do something else with somebody. Find something that will be above and beyond, both in its excellence, but also in the time that you give. One writer, Matthew McMahon, who writes a number of things on work ethic, has said, work heartily, not lazily. Proverbs 6:6-11 tells us that the most ants are more productive than most people. Every time a Christian is lazy in his work, every time he is not pursuing excellence, he becomes a thief. Does God really mean thou shalt not steal? Yes, stealing and laziness is just as offensive as a pickpocket. Laziness is your vocation. for stealing from those who are paying you for your labor. And it brings a reproach to God. If God commands us to pursue excellence, He commands us to work heartily. If He commands us to serve Christ, less than this would be sin. Those are some strong words. But I think most of us would probably agree with those words. What about a difficult boss? Well, we'll get into a lot of that today. 1 Peter chapter 2, 18 through 20 tells about that. And I would just say this, when it comes to working for a difficult boss, do whatever they say as long as it doesn't violate the teachings of Christ. If it goes there, then you have a right to say no. Otherwise, do what they have asked you and try to do it with the right attitude, in a cheerful heart. It's amazing how sometimes an employee can impact the way their employer treats them because of the respect that they show their employer. Because it's almost unexpected today in our culture. One study has shown this, and I found this interesting. As soon as an employee assigns their boss with a designation other than their title or boss, their performance on the job begins to decline. The examples they gave: commandant, jerk. And they went through this list of just offhanded comments people would make about their bosses. And they said, as soon as you adopt that mindset, you no longer shall respect or do your full performance at work. So as employees, that's the overriding command. For employers, I would just say this: employers should treat their employees with fairness and respect. Look what it says. Masters, do the same then, and stop your threatening, knowing that He who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with Him. In other words, you're not more important than your employee. In the eyes of God, you are equal. And therefore treat each other with respect. And if you are in the position of authority, there's those two aspects. I think both fairness and respect. And fairness means that you pay them a fair wage. You expect what is reasonable, but don't expect what is unreasonable. To show them respect means that you don't speak down to them and belittle them, but instead you teach them what respect looks like. I love that there's no favoritism with the Lord. This doesn't mean, in this whole context, that there's not expectations, accountability, those things are there. And as an employer, you must hold those standards. But you can do that still with an attitude of fairness and respect to those whom you lead. In fact, maybe even taking that mentality that if they're not measuring up, maybe this is a chance for their personal growth if I step in and handle this in a way that challenges them up rather than beats them down. Now let me give you a couple of applications to that that might impact some of you that maybe aren't in the corporate world like you have been in the past. And that is this: how do you treat the people that do your yard work, that cut your trees, that clean your house? Do you treat them with respect? You know, I have learned this from my wife. We had a lady that would clean our house back in Houston. And she was a Hispanic lady. I think she was from Honduras. And I just watched Allie develop a relationship with this woman to the where by 2 years into it, I mean, they were hugging each other at the door. She would call Allie and ask her to pray for things that were going on in her world. Allie's getting her kids presents for graduation. And I just looked at that and I said, that's it. That's how you treat everyone with fairness and respect. And she got on to me all the time about, we need to give her a bigger Christmas bonus. And I'm like, honey, we already pay her no, bigger Christmas bonus. She probably deserves it. She's like family. In fact, Allie tried to convince her to move here with us, but she chose not to. But how do you treat those that are in your everyday spheres, maybe at your house, if you're not actually in that corporate setting anymore? I can remember working on one of the jobs that I worked for my dad. And I'll leave you with this thought, this picture. So we were working in a concrete crew. And in the concrete crew, we did two things. We broke out concrete with jackhammers. At that time, I was 5'9", 145 pounds. So, you know, these other guys would get out there and they'd throw their bellies up on the thing and they would just do this. I'm doing this. But I'm learning, and then I'm shoveling concrete and doing all this, and I knew something, and that is that everybody on that crew, and by the way, I was the only white one on the crew, so they had some fun with that. But I knew they all knew that I was the big boss's son. And so I was like, anything I do here is going to reflect upon my dad. And so I would work my tail off. In fact, one of the older guys on the construction crew, he had to have been, at that time I thought he was 70. He was probably 40, But he worked on the construction crew all his life. And I can remember one time we were doing a 12-hour shift on a plant shutdown. And a truck of rocks had to be unloaded by shovel into wheelbarrows, then carted down 2 flights into where we were laying a foundation. And he goes, "Little Smith, come with me. The rest of you, try to keep up with us." And but it's that moment, I took that on to say, no matter where you're working, what you're doing, they want to know, how does he represent his Father? And here we talk about our Heavenly Father. And so whether we are leading someone, or we are employed by someone, or we're simply hiring someone, how will they see the ethics of our Heavenly Father in the way that we treat one another? Let me close with some prayer. Father God, you are so good to us, and that you give us practical instruction. And the book of Ephesians has so much at the first of it that is about doctrine and who we are in you and why you have done it. And then this last section has so much now, because of that, live in a certain way. And Father, I pray you would give us the grace to see where we fall short, where we can improve, and even affirmation of where we're doing well. May we be change agents in the world in which we live as it regards work. May we be change agents that point to the goodness of our Father and the grace of Jesus Christ. Amen.